Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to the All Things Policy podcast. I'm your host, Jaison. And in today's conversation, I'll be speaking to Karishma Mehrotra. But before that, a plug-in from the Takshashila Policy School. We are a public policy think tank and also a school of public policy. And we have education programs lasting one semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. And they are completely online. You can take them from anywhere. Admissions are currently open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and technology as policy. The application deadline, though, is the 27th of August. So hurry up and visit school.takshashila.org.in, find out more. And I'm delighted to invite Karishma Mehrotra, who is an Indian-American journalist and currently completing a Fulbright research grant in Bihar and Jharkhand. Her work focuses on issues of the future like technology, climate, urbanization, and migration. And she has worked at various news organizations, including the Indian Express, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Scroll.in, among many others. I'm delighted to have you on this episode, Karishma.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so just to give a context to our listeners, right? Like why I have you on the show today is primarily around this article that Karishma wrote for 52, which is again a fantastic website that everyone should check out. So the article is titled Human Touch, and it at a very basic level discusses what is a growing world of women, right, in small towns and villages who work in one of the most unglamorous jobs in the artificial intelligence supply chain, right? And which is data annotation, right? So Karishma, if you could just start off by maybe giving us a sense of what is data annotation and what kind of motivated you to kind of looking into this space.
Maybe I'll start with the second part first. So what motivated me was sort of talking. I was raised in the Silicon Valley in California, and I go back often and have conversations with people who, including in my family, are very immersed in the tech world there. And one of the things that I was hearing about was that this sort of data problem, that really the issue is getting your hands on enough amount of data, but more than that, being able to figure out how to label this data at a mass scale. And so that sort of had coming up, and it was different from this idea of big data, right? Because it's not just that you need a lot of data. You also need a way to, in some ways you can say clean that data, but I don't really think labeling is a cleaning, so to say. It's basically, if I were to explain data annotation, I think the easiest way for the audience to understand is to think back to if you've ever done a CAPTCHA on Google and you were asked to sort of point and click at the stop sign or the truck or the road or the bus. And so, believe it or not, that type of action that you've done is actually like a micro task for Google. And what ends up happening with that is it basically, along with a bunch of other images that are now partially labeled, are sort of funneled into an algorithm to tell that algorithm, like, look, here is a gajillion images of stop signs. And then that algorithm can then, next time it sees a stop sign, it has this base of a gajillion images of stop signs to know what a stop sign is. And so actually, data annotation is used for almost, these algorithms have become ubiquitous in our lives. So it's everywhere. It's used all the time for these algorithms to work. I think the field that now is emerging as a space that needs a lot of this work and a lot of data is self-driving cars. And that development is where I was hearing about this problem a lot, because basically for a code in a car to know that, okay, this person is walking, this person is running, this is what a motorcycle looks like, this is what, et cetera, all these different sort of base training that code will need will come from this, from somebody labeling that data and teaching it. Another way to think about it maybe, and this came up often in my reporting, is a way for people who are trying to teach me about this work, is the same way that you tell a kid, you point to red and say the word red enough times, and you point to blue and say the word blue enough times, hopefully at some point that kid sees something that's red and the kid themselves says, oh, look, this is red. So that way that the brain is sort of has a bunch of inputs, categorizes those inputs, and then next time a new input comes in is able to fit the category is basically what's happening here. Like this is machine learning. This is the training that's happening in the background. And yeah, I don't remember when or how I realized that India was a large destination for this work. But once I did realize it, and then I just sort of started to talk, like before I was reporting the story, I just was talking to people who were involved in this area. And they were the ones who were telling me, this is actually happening in towns much smaller than you would think they're happening in. And then I sort of started asking more questions to see what they meant by that, like what towns and small villages, I'm putting quotes around the word villages, is this happening in? And then I was pretty amazed that yes, it is. And then more and more, it sort of came up in conversation that how in these towns and villages, the levels of education for women have increased exponentially over the past, decade or so, to the point where some of the CEOs of this company that they weren't even trying to have a social impact lens. They weren't even trying to really say, let's go out and employ a bunch of women. Yep. It just made business sense that you have these highly, almost overly educated women who are waiting for work in their town, and they were approaching some of these companies. So then it sort of blossomed as a story about women in smaller tier 2, tier 3 towns who are doing this work. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, right? As I mentioned, I would strongly recommend everyone to kind of read this story, maybe once you've listened to the episode. But I want to get straight down to one of the story's protagonists, right? And it's a very profound quote that I like to maybe start off the conversation on. And it's a woman by the name of Chandmuni, right? Chandmuni. So on seeing a company, she is determined to work only in a job that lets her use one, right? And she's currently like working in a job where she does more of administrative work. So the quote is as follows, right? So I saw others touch it and I thought I should too. But when I touched it, I didn't understand anything. So I think like you've beautifully unpacked the psyche of someone who comes from circumstances where the use of technology is, say, near zero, but it continues to capture the imagination, right? In many ways. So given the challenging like socioeconomic backgrounds of these women, what was your experience hearing from them firsthand about their rationale for wanting to work in a job like this? For instance, data labeling.
Yeah, I think Chandmuni was specifically so interesting because maybe I'll back up and just describe a little bit of the landscape of what I saw and then where Chandmuni fits into that. So I went to 2 locations to see this work. One was Ranchi in Jharkhand. Another was a place called Mannarkad in Kerala. And so the women in both of these towns were quite different, right? We're talking about 2 very different places in this country. So Chandmuni lived about 30 kilometers or so away from Ranchi. And what was different between Ranchi and Mannarkad was most of the women that I had met in Ranchi were either the only women in their families working, or definitely their generation was the only women. They had not seen women older than them working in going to an office in any way. Whereas in Kerala, it was a mixed bag. There were quite a few women whose mothers had worked. And so this is the context of a place like Ranchi, where I'd also met a lot of women where they were working outside or against the wishes of their parents-in-laws or their parents, or, so women working in this context was, I think, particularly unique in Jharkhand. And Chandmuni, she was 24 years old when I met her. And so I started, the conversation with her way back to just the first time that she had sort of decided that she was going to use a computer. And her context, her family, she has 7 total siblings in her family. She comes from a tribal Adivasi family, and everyone in her family, except for one other sibling, was full-time working in the field as a farmer. And even that one sibling who wasn't working on the farm didn't have necessarily an office job that you could say. And so she even had other sisters who were not really allowed to work. I mean, the context which she described it, it was sort of as if they also weren't inclined to work and there wasn't a push for them to work. But she was characterized as very different in her family. And she had sort of made a decision very early on that it seems like the way to get out of this is to figure out this whole computer thing. And she actually didn't make it into this story because I guess it's just a lot of detail about her life in particular. But she tried to go to a computer course in her little block. And this computer course, they didn't even let her use, nobody who is learning in this computer course could touch the computer. And so this is why the quote came up, is because she went to this whole computer course having looked at a computer. And she had said, they weren't really working very well. It wasn't even turned on. It was basically somebody with a whiteboard describing how to use a computer. She would keep asking them, like, can I use this? Can I touch it? And I like how she used the word chuna. Like, she specifically used the word touch. And then she went to a different computer course. She was sort of fed up with this idea that she couldn't even touch this computer in this first course. So she went to this other computer course. And there is where she finally was able to touch a computer. And I think, it's quite obvious, I think, as a woman in this town, if you have some amount of education. And Chandmani, her context was that she was actually a housekeeping staff for this company. And while she was sort of doing her job as a housekeeping staff, she would sort of observe and she would joke with the employees that, let me also touch the computer. Let me also practice. Teach me how you're doing this. And it was one of the managers at the company that said, you seem interested. How educated are you? Would you be able to do this? And I think at that point, she hadn't finished her metric. I don't remember the exact detail, but she had more education basically to complete. She had more schooling to complete. So they said, you finish your schooling, you stay around, we will train you. You'll eventually get there. Just keep at it, finish up your schooling. So she did all of that. Even then, when she got as a data operator in this company called iMerit, she was still sort of completing, I think at that point, maybe her master's. So it was sort of years of this transition that took place. And yeah, so Chandmani is a bit unique in the women that I met because of the fact her entire family was working as farmers and hadn't, been to an office before, including the men. And the fact that she sort of entered into this space from a very unique trajectory. But all of the women I met, it's a pretty obvious answer that if you have a job like this opening up in your town, of course you would choose it. And that's something I think throughout my reporting I've seen. Most people don't want to leave their hometown. And if given the option for a job of where they're based that is decent enough, they would easily take it up. And so I think part of this story is also, like I said, that women's education has increased so much, but it's sort of surpassed the employment prospects in towns like these for these women. And the main thing they're looking for is A, this job is close to home, and B, this job is somewhat flexible in the sense that if you need to work from home, you can work from home. And somehow within this industry, what I saw amongst the companies that I had spoken to, they actually had very good policies to help women continue working after they had a kid. Some of the managers had spoken about how they sort of deal with the fact that once women get married, their parents-in-law start to make noises about them working, how they sort of, they're interacting with these issues. And so the companies have also developed a sort of way in which to keep the women who are doing good work. Of course, some of the CEOs said things that I myself don't know how exactly to react to, like things like women are better at this work, like women have whatever, there's something about how women work that they're better because it is a very precise. You have to be super precise. Like if you look at them doing this work, imagine a hand on a screen and you're taking small dots and you're just placing dots next to each other around the hand, sort of showing the shape of the hand. So you're just basically staring at this one image, trying to just
Wow.
circulate it in with this tool. And it's an interesting one. I've actually spoken to a researcher who studies gender studies, and she told me about this thing called the nimble hands theory, nimble hands hypothesis. Basically, how in the US after the war, many women had joined into like textiles and sewing and etc. And a lot of the explanation at the time is that women have like nimble hands, so they're able to do that work well. And it's an interesting one because obviously we feel a bit like it's stereotyping women. It's placing them in specific jobs. But I think, there's also, and this is something we can get to maybe in a later question, but there is an empowerment angle here as well. So while there are parts of my intellectual brain that sort of cringe at certain aspects of this story, including the sort of imbalanced global supply chain, I think at the end of the day, the women, if you just listen to their stories and just sit with them, it would almost have been such a disservice to them and their stories to negate that and just focus on these sort of higher level intellectual cringes that I have. And that nuance was difficult for me to figure out, I think. And we can talk about that whenever, again, if you want.
Yeah, no, I think this was quite interesting and a great tidbit on the computer course she had signed up for. So that's interesting. So, another running thread in your story, and I think you did touch upon that, like you didn't want to do a disservice to them by negating, the decision or their choice of doing this. But I also wanted to then ask you about, there's this absence of critical inquiry about the nature of the work that they do, for instance, right? And the consequences of this work, say in terms of driverless cars, automation, etc. And this is another protagonist, Sunita Kumari is her name, who works in iMirror's Ranchi office. And she says, and I quote, "I don't know what the work is about. Sir hasn't told us. We just do the work. I did think about the work's purpose, but since they didn't tell me, I stopped thinking about it." Close quote. Now, we grappled with these ethical questions around automation, future of work, and these are very first world debates, right, that we have at this point. But, did these statements make you wonder about how these conversations don't normally account for the lived experience, right, of people who actually provide this labor that enable, systems like automation, for instance, to thrive? So is that a question that you grappled with, wherein on the one hand, you had very high level debates around these issues, but you look at the lived experience of people, it gives you a completely different sort of perspective.
Yeah, I grappled with it a lot. I wouldn't say necessarily it was a completely different lived experience. I think it was just an experience almost in some way just existed adjacent or tangential and didn't really, if I describe, so basically I eventually in conversations with women, at some point I would obviously ask them, like, do you know why you're doing this work? Like, what does it connect to? And very, very, very few of them even cared to respond, like very few of them were like, nay. It was a question that just didn't have anything to do with their lives. Those that didn't choose to respond usually touched upon similar, words like computer. I think very, very few used even the phrase artificial intelligence. Occasionally they would, but for the most part, they were really more focused in how it had changed their lives. There were two women who were really, really, really sort of detailed in their explanation of what they thought this work was. And that was very fascinating to talk about. Both of those women, though, had sort of risen to a managerial level and had been working on this for maybe 6 years or 7 years or so. And with them, it was even more fascinating because then you have someone in front of you who understands the work. And then I was able to then get into that other question that I'm grappling with, which is you are here in this small town and you're getting paid 10 to 15,000. You're very well aware that the people who are building the code for this live in some foreign land and are getting paid exorbitant amounts, like much, much more than you, and living lives that are much, much more lavish than yours. Do you ever think about that? Do you care? Does it matter? The only woman who said that she cared about this and had thought about this was not doing data labeling work. She was actually like a administrative person at the company called Infolks in Kerala. The woman in Ranchi who I was able to actually get into this, the nuts and bolts of this conversation with, she really didn't care. like very well aware that this is happening and it just doesn't matter. And one of the CEOs for Infolks, Mujib, he kind of put it well that, any big monument that you see is being built by laborers. But who gets the credit for when we go and visit these monuments, we're not really talking about those who actually chipped away. Maybe us in our elite circles are thinking about those laborers who once chipped away at the stone. But really, when you read about this monument, when you think about the monument, it's the people who designed it. And they never really did much of the grunt work, but they were the envisioners. They're the ones who envisioned it. And I think with this story, what I wanted to do was have the reader be able to hold both truths in their head at once. Like, it is possible for global supply chains to be exploitative. It is possible for there to be an imbalance between who's doing what work and who's getting paid for what. And at the same time, to have moments of empowerment and narratives of empowerment within that. And, what the policymaker should do with that is up to them. I don't know how you address this. I did speak to a woman, Nithya, who used to be at Google Research, and she's written quite a few academic articles on this. And she talks quite a bit about the sort of difference between data work on one side and sort of code or model work on the other side. And her main argument is that this imbalance is actually creating a problem with the algorithms, because what you've done is some of the most important work. You characterized it as the sort of like whatever foo grunt work that needs to be outsourced. Someone needs to do it. Let's just get a bunch of people to do it at mass scale. Like, we just had to solve this problem. But the MIT and Stanford graduates sitting in California, they are given this like coveted work, the work of sort of intention. And the problems we're seeing in algorithms today, Nithya's argument is that those problems are actually data problems. It's problems of not having accurately or precisely labeled data. So because you created certain work, you sort of devalued certain work, you created a system that has this problem. And this goes back to where I first heard about the problem, because most engineers and top whatever CEOs and managers in Silicon Valley will readily admit to you that there's a huge data problem. And so Nithya sort of enters this from the place, of course there's a data problem, because you've devalued data labor and you're not treating that labor as a sort of glamorized part of AI. And so therefore, of course, all the people who have the glamorized work in AI are scratching their heads, wondering why there's a data problem. So that's Nithya's argument. And that might be something for policymakers to think about and for these engineers to also think about. But for me as a journalist, I think what I cared about was, okay, so there's these multiple truths going on. They don't always seem to agree with each other, but how do I present them all to a reader? And the best way to do that is to do that through people's stories. And that's why the majority of the story to me was just different women's lives. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult for somebody to poke holes at somebody else's just life story. I mean, it's a certain truth that we have we can't intellectually sort of say, no, that didn't happen to you. You didn't feel really happy from your 10,000, 15,000 salary. Like, you didn't feel a sort of empowerment within your household. Like, that's difficult for us to tell somebody. And therefore, I wanted to just show the truth of their narrative and their anecdotes as much as I could, while also including the research papers and the academics and the theorists. And this also goes back to this thing that actually, when I first started researching this story, I even myself approached it from a very negative angle. It's super rare that a tech journalist these days gets to write a very, tech utopia story. Not that my story is tech utopia, but anything positive about tech is actually quite rare nowadays. Yeah. So even I am like, okay, am I ready? I had most of the research papers on this topic, most of the sort of white papers, other than your like Niti Aayog and whatnot, are very negative about this industry. Part of that, the reason behind that is because this industry has only very recently been formalized. Before this, it was a form of gig work. So many people might have heard of Amazon's Mechanical Turk.
Oh.
And so within the gig world, I'm sure that I didn't research it at that time. I didn't speak to actual workers at that time, but I'm sure there were much more egregious examples of exploitation. But it became formalized because, again, the companies were wanting they just wanted more accuracy. They wanted this to be done much faster. And they were dealing with data security issues. So it's almost like the nature of the work and the needs of the client sitting in their sort of foreign land changed. And it was actually changed for the better in terms of the labor. So once the work became more formalized, then you have maternity leave, and then you have somebody in office who can look after your baby, and then you have an actual manager you can talk to. And then you can, also do work from home, but you have a set salary. And so I think all of those things came when the companies changed their needs. And I don't think there's been much reporting and research on how this industry looks post that gig phase. It's an interesting type of tech work. I'd be interested to know if there are other types of tech work that started off as gig work and then became formalized over time. And it also gives us an example of how when you do formalize gig work, it might alleviate some of the problems that we deal with. Then the question though becomes, okay, what do the workers actually want? And that within gig work is a huge question. For me, it's a huge question mark. I don't think there's been necessarily a so-called experiment of this in India, but in the US, there's a lot of propositions that have been proposed to formalize aspects of gig work. And many have failed. And I know at least one has failed in California. And some have argued that the gig workers themselves don't want it to be formalized. So this is a question mark, but I think it's something we're thinking about how within the tech world, often labor begins as gig work, and what sort of direction works after that.
Yeah, so I think, just to complement what Karishma said there, so NASSCOM, which is an IT industry body, so they've come out with a report which kind of said that there are roughly 70,000 people working in this field, and the market size is estimated at about $250 million, right? So this is 2021 data. So certainly a burgeoning field. I just wanted to now talk about, in terms of, the data labeling companies themselves, right? So one of the, I guess, the semi-skilled nature of this work is that you don't need to have proficiency in spoken English, but, you kind of just set up the digital infrastructure and you find people to kind of do this stuff. I'm just interested to know when you spoke to these company CEOs, right? And Mujib, I think, is the perfect example of being a labeler himself first and then going on to start a labeling company on his own. So in terms of what were their impediments, right, that they were facing? And is there a worry that maybe one day the stiff competition from, say, tech companies, since you said this has become more formalized work, and let's say tech companies were to now take over these kind of tasks, right, and set up, say, data centers, kind of do the same thing. So when you spoke to the CEOs, did they have any sense of worry about looking into the future?
Yeah, they definitely had quite a bit of worries. I mean, there were, other than this whole looking into the future and what will happen, in general, it's not like it was smooth sailing for the CEOs to enter into these small towns. The reason why they're entering into these small towns, just to address that part, is unlike the call center world, like you said, you don't need to speak English. And since the call center, like BPO time and moment in India's history, these small towns, the infrastructure of these small towns, the urbanization has changed so much. And I think it's we can talk about migration and urbanization if you want, but a lot of sort of framings of urbanization now are not about people migrating necessarily from rural to urban, but from villages themselves sort of becoming towns, and sort of internal urbanization that's happening. And I think this story is that's a landscape, like a background landscape that's happening. But one of the obstacles that the CEOs would deal with is that middle level management is very difficult for them to find in these cities. And they had a hard time you can find a bunch of people who are willing to do this type of work, but can you find that person who's getting paid like 20 to 30K and living in this small town and is able to manage 40 people underneath them? And so that type of middle management was a difficulty. As for the future, which is your main question, I didn't hear anyone talk about tech companies buying them out. Tech companies anyway have internal labeling verticals. Almost all of them have some amount of labeling that happens internally, mostly for data that's way too sort of secretive, proprietary to be able to even be given out. What they were worried about, and I think this is also a really interesting one, is they were worried that at some point their job is going to be obsolete. This whole world of data annotation is going to be obsolete. So this concern I'm starting to hear from the CEOs. And then, so I go back to the sort of, the computer geeks sitting in the Silicon Valley and stuff. And I ask them, what do you guys think? Like, do you envision a world where data annotation actually doesn't have to exist? And they're like, no, we can't really envision that world. But we can envision a world where this particular type of low-level data annotation might not need to exist. And if you think about it, we're at this phase, and you can almost think about it like algorithm teaching. Like we're teaching all these computers about the human world. And right now we're at like, a 1-year-old. We're literally just telling them like, this is an orange, or maybe a little bit more than a 1-year-old. I don't know exactly what we're at. That's a good question. I should have asked them. But we're at a sort of level of like, look, this orange looks rotten. This is a man running. Like we're at a level of like just blocking out the vantage points of what we see in the world. So what happens when the algorithm has understood those things? We've developed a bunch of algorithms that get this stuff. We don't really need to teach them that anymore. And what if now we're teaching, there were some examples that I remember Jay had given, right? Like, is this ear of corn diseased? Does this wind turbine have damage? All of a sudden, the bar is now raised for what the humans have to teach these machines. And in that world, then Chandamuni is probably not the one to be employed anymore, right? Whoever the Chandamuni of this 5-10 years down the line, she now doesn't have that employment option for herself. Now, there was another CEO who had told me that he sees a world where in all of our professions, if you're a doctor, part of your career is actually doing this work so that then you're basically training an algorithm that is helping 1,000 more people than you can. And you're you're that initial funnel. And then you teach, you just label a bunch of MRIs about what a certain tumor looks like. And if that becomes a part of your job, now that algorithm can do that for a bunch of MRIs. So that was what he envisioned, that slowly and slowly we're going to, and Jay had mentioned that he calls us experts in the loop. So right now, this world right now is called humans in the loop. Will we enter a world where it's not actually all humans anymore that are required? It's certain types of experts. So what does that mean for the humans that are currently in the loop? And the CEOs that were most frightened about this were Mujib and those who worked at Info. They're full on setting up a research division to be like, how do we solve for the future of this? And for them and for many people, they're looking at the call center world, and it's all taken over by bots. And so for them, it's total. And this is actually something that even if a woman couldn't describe to me what work they're doing, as in they couldn't describe how this work links into the larger AI pipeline, they would still express fear of being automated out from this ecosystem. So that much of knowledge or fear was pretty well, was expressed quite heavily. And so I think that's the main fear that many of the CEOs, and I think it's an interesting one to keep in mind. I do think there was just this interesting division between those who are working in it and the fears they were expressing, and those who are working on the code or sitting in Silicon Valley who are like, it's just not going to happen anytime soon. It's really not that. It's almost like the trust within AI is more amongst the layman that, they're definitely going to figure out how to automate this stuff. But those who are actually working on it don't actually trust that it's going to be automated that quickly. Those who actually know the ins and out of it more than you and I do are very much like, no, this isn't that easy to be automated. Eventually, maybe, but we're still at such a basic level that whatever we're training for oranges, now we have to have a whole separate training for apples. So like the amount of work and the basic level we're at is they just can't think that, oh, it's going to be automated anytime soon.
Yeah.
So that divergence, that sort of discrepancy was interesting.
Yeah, so Karishma, I'll just end with this whole story of human perseverance, because they go through like a lot of struggles, right? And in fact, I wouldn't do justice by kind of just quoting them. I think people should just read the article themselves, right? And, there's the aspect of, the empowerment that such jobs give these women. I'm just very curious to know, like, did any of the protagonists in your story, the women, harbor any aspirations to start something on their own around this space? So any interesting stories you have that you can share with us, then we'll kind of wrap up.
Yeah, so Chandmani we talked about, and I think she was one of the most interesting. Another that was quite interesting to me was this woman, Pushpi. And I walked into iMerit in Ranchi and walked into their training room waiting for the manager to come and meet me. And I saw Pushpi breastfeeding her baby in the training room. And she was just joining. And she was super vocal. She was like a journalist's dream. She just went on about her life story immediately. She was talking about her parents-in-law and her husband, how many people she had to do, and blah, blah, blah. And her aspirations, I didn't hear that many women who wanted to start something in this field, but definitely I heard of women who were like, I want to start a business of my own. And the idea of starting a business of, I also heard a lot of women who wanted a government job, especially in Ranchi. And so that's a common aspiration, as we probably know. But Pushpi was interesting because of how much she had to fight to even get here and how much she was sort of doing on her own, carrying her baby to work, and her aspirations for the future. And I do think, but this is a mixed bag, because in the research about this world, there was a lot of research that I'd read that said, this is just a stepping stone for many women. This is not like the ultimate goal for them. This is a sort of interim thing. I would say in Kerala, I saw that a lot, where women were sort of looking at this as a stepping stone. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that all women were thinking that. I think many women were quite happy with what they had in front of them. In Kerala, you obviously had a lot of women who wanted to migrate abroad. So there was a few women who wanted to go to Dubai and experience life there. In Ranchi itself is a migration hub for many of the women. So they were already sort of migrating to a place. It wasn't too far. I mean, maybe they live on just the outskirts of Ranchi. But for them, this was quite an achievement already. So either it was a government job and then Pushpi wanted to start her own business. But yeah, I think it probably deserves a separate story to just understand the aspirations of these women beyond. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I just love what I would like to call this as, kind of a lot of spatial ironies in that these are data labeling companies that are set against a backdrop of, say, paddy fields and groves. You have women who are otherwise confined to their households, working, on computers, right? So I like the irony that runs throughout the story. And I think this was great for me to kind of read and just really indulge in your personal experience, right? That people go through. But Karishma, thank you so much for doing this. This was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it was really fun. And I'm glad you liked the story.
Yeah. So I'll sure to kind of link the article to our show notes. And yeah, it would be great to hear from the listeners what they think about this. Yeah, so thanks a lot.
Yeah. I would love to hear from listeners as well about what they think about the story. But thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.